Hello, Joe Uhan here, and I want to talk about posture today. We're going to talk about what efficient ideal posture is, the components of stacking and angling, some of the inefficiencies that we see, and why it's so darn important for fast and pain-free running. So posture is more than whether or not we're slouchy or not. It has to do with two fundamental concepts, which we talk about in the Iron Far article that I wrote on posture. And the first one talks about stacking. So a lot of people think about, oh, okay, well, no good posture is here. Well, there's more to it than that. So in the efficient state, we have all of these segments in our body. We can start down low, look at my ankle, lower legs are a segment, legs are a segment, but really the most important segments are pelvis, the trunk, and then the head. So stacking refers to if these are all building blocks, do they all stack in a line, or is one shifted one way or the other? So in the efficient state, you can see that I am stacked straight up and down, and how I can self-assess that, I can put a hand here and a hand here, and they should be able to drop straight down on one another. If there is an issue with stacking, we can have something like this, or something like this. But either way, it primarily has to do with an issue of how the pelvis stacks on the trunk. So that's element number one. Are these systems stacked in a line? We'll talk about why that's so important. The other thing that's a little more, I think, more obvious to some people, but maybe less to others, is angling. So angling has to do with, okay, how are these individual segments angled on top of one another after they've been well stacked. So even though I'm well stacked, I can have an angle imbalance either in extension or in flexion. And most people think it's like, oh yeah, well, this is bad posture. This is inefficient in flexion or too much flexion, whereas this is just as inefficient going into too much extension. However, we've been taught a lot in our lives that, oh, to stand up tall is really important. But this represents an asymmetry of that angling. So stacking has to do with these segments and how they sit on top of one another. Then the angling has to do kind of within the segment. Is there a balance in the shape? So if we're going to assess stacking and angling, we talked about hand positioning. So we want these hands to be able to line up straight up and down. So now that I'm here, sometimes we then have to look up at the head and make sure that if I'm used to being here and now I fix my stacking, now my head is out of a stacked alignment, I have to kind of bring that back. That's relatively simple. Angling gets a little bit more complicated because there are nuances especially with the trunk. So the biggest thing that you can do is to look into a mirror and make sure that this kind of bell shape, this rounded shape of our upper trunk, is sort of equally rounded in front versus in back. So you could call this a bell. And this bell shape, you can tell, is kind of ringing forward. There's too much of it going into extension. Or the bell now is ringing backwards. I'm too slumped into flexion. The vast majority of runners, especially younger runners, tend to err into too much extension. That chest is forward. Sometimes the pelvis is in on the act as well, and that is extended. And you can tell that I have this big arch through my trunk. So correcting that involves bringing the hands together so that I get a neutral position. And you can even see that at the pelvis. If I'm into this position, the waistband of my shorts is angled down. Conversely, if I get into this position, you can see that it's angled up. So that correction has to do with finding neutral either at the chest and or the pelvis. So let's talk about a few of these common positions. I've already identified some of them. This one I call the old man back. You will occasionally see this at the very end of a race. Sometimes us older runners will adopt this position, but by and large this is the least common of them. But you can tell there is an issue with excessive flexion. They probably have really great abs, these runners, but you can see that there is, my pelvis is tilting upward, my chest is tilting downward, there's too much curve here. What's far more common, especially among pretty fast runners, is the opposite, and that's too tall. The picture that I have in the Hour and Far video or article isn't quite as representative of what a lot of people do. And what that is a significant anterior tilt of the pelvis accompanied by extension. And again, we're told, oh, this is really good posture, but you can tell that this is out of neutral. I'm thrusted forward, I have a lot of compression in my low back, and conversely, there's a lot of stretching or relatively less activation in my abs. This is too tall. The last one, and potentially the worst one, the most dysfunctional, is this one. I unfortunately spend way too much time here. I'm not exactly sure what to call this, but this is an anterior pelvis position where there's a clear stacking deficit. There's a little bit of an angle problem because I'm now kind of angling back as a counterbalance, but because my hips are thrust so far forward, it makes efficient movement really difficult. So these are the most common positions that I see working with runners either in the clinic or in a coaching realm, and all of these things are going to cause either performance or aches and pains issues. So why is all this so important? It's important for three reasons. Number one, when we're in the efficient state, namely having that efficient stacking of pelvis underneath the trunk, our hips do exactly what we need them to do. So if we take this position into running, here I am standing erect. If I now go into a running position, you can see that my hips and my pelvis are now behind me. And that's super important because the hips need to be behind to promote propulsion. Conversely, if we're in this position and I'm trying to run, I can't get my hip back there. That's the limitation that's the most hip extension I can get because of a posture issue, not a strength or a mobility issue at the hip. I just can't, it's just not underneath me. I can't get it behind. So strong hips is the number one reason this is super important. Number two is when we are adequately stacked and neutral angled. You have a balance between the abdominal system, the flexion system in front, and the extension system behind. So as opposed to either being here or being here, when I am here and here, I get automatic core engagement, which besides holding this system strong and efficient, the abs can be used to powerfully help the hip to flex. So more hip drive, more forward momentum, and conversely, more driving here is more push off here. So automatic core engagement, even stronger hips. Last but not least, maybe the most important for avoiding aches and pains is when we're in this efficient state, our foot strike is efficient. And efficient means our foot lands underneath us. If the pelvis is forward, man, it is hard, if not impossible, to get a foot to land underneath your center of mass. Because if your pelvis is here and your center of mass is that kind of average of your body weight is back here, there's no way you can get that foot under there, and it's going to be constant braking forces into your body. And that plays such a huge role in aches and pains and something that we're always trying to avoid. It's really posture, getting in this position, is what's going to make that automatically efficient. So how do we then apply this to running? So the first thing that we do, we just get into a mirror, we stack hands on top of one another. If they fall down, we know we're in a good place. If you just look into the mirror and say, okay, I'm straight up and down, no matter how strange it feels, you know you're in a good place. this is the angling's a little bit tougher, but again, just kind of looking at that general shape. Then it's like, how do we apply it to running? What we then have to do is to take this shape into this position, because we know we need to be forward. So I like to practice this in a starting line sort of position. Put the foot back, feel how the hips or the pelvis is posterior, feel how the chest is relaxed down, and that's where we want to be. So think about that for yourselves. Where are you at posturally? Can you make improvements here? Feel that difference and then go try it on in a run. Good luck.